The locomotive suddenly lurched with an ear-piercing squeal. Gasping, Jacqueline pitched forward as the brakes dug in. Angelique yelped as she fell to the floor, growling her displeasure as she climbed back up on the cushion. Cries of alarm rose from the adjacent first-class coaches. Jacqueline peered through the dissipating smoke. The train had halted in the middle of a vast meadow. Off beyond the fields, a simple church spire rose above grey roofs. She looked at Angelique and shook her head. Not yet. Probably cows on the track, said the man seated across from her. He set his sketchbook down and stood stiffly. Just in time. He opened the carriage door and peered about. I could do with some fresh air. He turned back to retrieve his fez from the corner of his seat. As he set it on his head, he turned to Jacqueline to offer a hand. When she recognized Eugène Delacroix, she suddenly realized why Angelique had found their situation so amusing. Delacroix counted among the coterie of artists whose salons Angelique frequented. Jacqueline demurred, looking away. Delacroix turned and stepped down, then jumped the remaining meter to the tracks, through hissing billows of steam. As he descended the railbed, he drew a silver cigar case from his vest pocket and placed a panatella to his lips. Jacqueline chuckled. Fresh air indeed. Angelique growled. Jacqueline stroked her sister's brow. If you didn't have half the Paris prefecture looking for the notorious Angelique Laforge, you could have ridden in your human form, so you can very well quit your growling. And no, I have no wish to engage with your friend Delacroix. She rubbed Angelique's ear to calm her. Patience, mon ange, we'll soon be there. And I wired ahead for a diligence to convey us to Bellefay, so it will await us. We should be home in time for supper. Her smile turned to a determined pout. Time for some new designs. Thinking of her drafting board, Jacqueline leaned over to see what the artist had been sketching. To no surprise, she saw her own face in several casts of repose or gazing out the carriage window, along with various poses of Angelique, maw to paws, or head resting on Jacqueline's lap. Delacroix had focused on Jacqueline's curls and the roundness of her eyes, but she wasn't happy with his depiction of her wide cheeks or her strong jaw and mouth. The sketches accentuated her less than feminine features. He had also insisted on portraying her bosom rather décolletée, despite the fact she wore a travel coat. Thank goodness he hadn't seen her without her coat. Her arms, large and firm and muscular from years at the forge, would have made him wonder if she were a woman at all. Angelique's ear perked up and flickered. She pawed at them and whined. Sliding from the seat, she panted sudden anxiety. Jacqueline stood to leave their coach, watching as several second and third-class passengers, mostly men, passed the forward first-class cars to see what had stopped the train. Angelique leapt from the car. Jacqueline was about to step down, but halted when her poised foot knocked a tall grey hat off a gentleman hurrying past below the railbed. She managed to catch the hat. "I'm so sorry," she cried. "Your pardon, mademoiselle," he said at the same time. "I didn't see—" He broke off his sentence with a dazzling smile as he looked up into her face. "Madame Duval? What a pleasure to meet you." Jacqueline didn't recognize him, and could not fathom how he would know her. She turned her head and mumbled, hoping to avoid conversation. "From the Brussels Exposition last year," he pursued. "Forgive me, we haven't met, but I found your presentation on the conservation of engine emissions fascinating." Jacqueline looked again to assess his features. She was never good with names unless they came attached to commissions for her engineering designs, but she considered making an exception for this man. He was older than she, probably by at least 10 years, and his wild curly blonde hair suggested he was of that fashion called romantic by the effete. He stood tall and muscular, with a long, earnest face, clean-shaven, bright brown eyes, a Greek nose, and a bow to his upper lip that fascinated her as he smiled hopefully. Jacqueline curtsied with a slight nod, and she couldn't help returning his smile with equal warmth. Please, she said, just Duval. Alain de Guise, he returned. I work with the railway. Your designs are quite revolutionary, if you don't mind my use of the word. She smiled even wider, blushing. At least 2 investors thought so as well. Ah, that explains why the prefect was so interested in you, he said. I let him know his error. Imagine France's foremost engineering genius stealing some bauble from a Moroccan prince. Jacqueline's breath caught. Angelique whined and circled. Embarrassed for her sister's sake, Jacqueline curtsied again and excused herself. But de Guise stayed where he was and extended his hand. Please allow me. Jacqueline gathered her skirt and petticoats and accepted de Guise's hand to guide her down the steps. He caught her as she jumped from the bottom step, holding onto her waist until she regained her balance. Unaccustomed to such intimacy, Jacqueline pulled away. De Guise then offered his arm. She considered it with a growing sense of discomfort. Thank you, but I need... Angelique nosed between them and pushed Jacqueline forward. De Guise stared in astonishment as Jacqueline set her hand on the wolf's head instead of on his arm. Thank you again, Monsieur de Guise, she called as she took her leave of him. Mud pulled at her short boots and spattered her stockings and hem as she hurried forward. De Guise followed, which made her worry she had offended him, for he had been nothing but charming for those brief moments. Surprisingly, she rather enjoyed his attentions. But for the nonce, she was more concerned with the annoyance of the delay. If I'm eating supper at midnight tonight, I shall be very put out. Angelique snorted an agreement. Jacqueline's complaint was mollified somewhat when she came around the front of the great green locomotive and saw what had halted the train. The men who had gathered formed a wide circle beside the track, ignoring the engineer's admonitions to keep back. As she pushed her way forward, they parted to allow plenty of room for the she-wolf at her side. Jacqueline smirked, sensing their dilemma in deciding which was the more bizarre sight, the girl and her wolf, or the metal form lying across the tracks, clanking almost as much as the locomotive. Its legs jerked and twitched, as if an interior engine had caught somehow. A mechanical man, she said.